Okay, I think we're rolling here. All right, Ancient Greece and Rome class. It is I, Dr. Bruce, visiting your respective apartments and dorm rooms and homes. So this is a recording being done on Monday the 14th. And most of you will probably be watching it either later this evening or tomorrow or whatever, but this is going to walk us through some basic components of classical Greek philosophy. Specifically, we'll talk mostly on Plato today, because what we know of Socrates is actually through Plato, but certainly spend a few minutes on Socrates and lay some things out. Just some reminders. So I know you've been, like me, you've been following all the events here. So, but by the way, I have to start off. So I have my, we're Chicago sports fans in this house, and so today I dutifully have on my Chicago Bears. There we go. See, my Chicago Bears Mitchell Trubisky jersey, because the Bears won yesterday and up in Detroit, actually, an away game up in Detroit to start the season, and came back in dramatic form and in dramatic fashion, I should say, and pretty dramatic come from behind victory. So it was a fun day for us. So I've got a little bit of Bears gear on here. So if you have, good thing is this is a recording, so I don't have to listen to any shouts and jeers from the audience. So if you don't like the Bears, the good news is you have no choice but to keep it to yourself. I won't be able to hear you. So it's a one-way deal. You have to listen to me talk about how wonderful how wonderful Chicago sports teams are, and I don't have to listen to your derision. I'm just messing with you. Okay, so a couple of things. I think we're all pretty clear on this, but I just had a couple of students that seemed a little bit confused. So we have those bios, those video bios that were initially going to be due today. I have pushed those back a little bit, and those are now due for the Greek set number 1. Those are due on Friday the 18th, okay? So just a little bit longer. I think that will just help everybody make it through and get things squared away. And remember, once you're done with your presentation and you've recorded it and you've uploaded that to YouTube, you need to provide me with the link, which I will then put on Populi for the other students to access, because everyone is going to be watching the presentations as students do them. And I'll incorporate at some level, I'll incorporate the presentations, maybe a kind of random presentation or two to the exam. I haven't decided exactly how, but the information will be involved on the exam in some way, as much as I can make that happen. So regardless, those are graded components, and I need you guys to go through and do a really great job on them. I think that's it for due dates this week. I anticipate the possibility of being back together in the classroom on Wednesday morning, but obviously this is not gone according to anyone's expectation. I didn't think we'd be gone all week last week, let alone still, no in-person classes today, and here we are. So we'll play it by ear. I think there is a legitimately good chance we'll be back in the classroom by Friday, because there are some rain maybe tonight and tomorrow, but most assuredly a little bit later in the week, like Wednesday, Thursday. So I think we have a legitimate chance for Friday at the least, but hopefully we'll be in the classroom together, either in person or with the OWL Zoom room stuff on Wednesday. That would be great. Either way, we're going to stay, pushing forward here. I don't want to get behind. So we're actually right where I want us to be. And on Wednesday, we get to start one of my favorite components of the course, which is a walkthrough for about a week, a walk through the Great Peloponnesian War from 431 to 404 BC. So that's where we're going this week. it is incumbent upon you to stay up with the reading. So please do that. Remember that you also have one of the supplementary books for the semester, Victor Davis Hanson's book on the Peloponnesian Wars, A War Like No Others, the title. You have to have read that book by next week. So at the very least, and some of you will be doing, if you choose to, you'll be doing your book review. So that's one of the books that you can do a book review on. And I want you to be aware of that. So stay abreast of all this stuff. Look at your syllabus. Make sure you understand those due dates. The only due date I have shifted to this point has been the Greek Set 1 video, individual video bios. So for right now, everything else is slated as it's always been scheduled in the syllabus. So just make sure you check that. Okay, we're going to dig in here because I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time. I think I might actually be able to get through this in about maybe a half hour-ish, a little over a half hour. So I don't think you'll be watching for 50 plus 55 minutes or whatever a couple of the others have been. So let's dig in and talk about Greek philosophers. You note the slide here is the famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. And it's representative of not only the depiction of, obviously you see in these hallowed halls, right, and the various formulations here. You have the depictions of philosophers themselves, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle at the center, as they should be, and there's importance to that. We'll kind of dig into the variants, the differences with these guys in just a minute. So Greek philosophy is pretty, multifaceted, right? So we have Greek philosophers, those who claim the foundations of Greek philosophy, even alive and well later on in the Roman era. So even if we're talking about guys like the Epicureans and the Stoics, the reality is, even though they're practitioners during the Roman era, they hearken back to the Greeks. So like with everything, the Romans don't invent much themselves. They might elaborate upon things that the Greeks started, but the foundational principles, even in philosophy, the Romans are standing on the shoulders of the Greek giants themselves, and and elaborating. So let's make some connections, and I want to try to do this through the lens of worldview and connection to Christianity in particular. The intellectual movements that I think had the most influence on early Christianity, as we will see, were, not surprisingly, these Greek schools of philosophy. And one of the things I think is important for us to understand, we throw this term philosophy around these days, and I think there's oftentimes a bit of a misnomer. What do we mean by philosophy? For a lot of people, when they think of philosophy, they think of, maybe somebody like Nietzsche comes to mind, or Sartre, or whoever it might be, right? One of the existentialists, the French existentialists with their beret and cigarettes. So somebody like Camus, perhaps. Or maybe, this idea that philosophers are these high-minded academics, these intellectuals that only really talk to each other in the hallowed halls of academia. And most other people cannot possibly, delve into philosophy all that much, which again is a misnomer. I think philosophy is one of the most important enterprises. I think any thinking person, especially any thinking Christian, should have a grasp of philosophy, and we've been pushing hard. Professor Stark and I, in particular, have been pushing hard for greater representation of philosophy within our curriculum at Corbin, and I think we're moving in that direction. I think it's absolutely essential for us to be able to articulate sound thinking, logic, rhetoric, and all the rest. So philosophy is an academic discipline primarily understood by specialists, maybe at this point in our history. But and I don't like, as I said, I don't know that I agree with that association, but that's the association most people have. But we're dealing with something very different if we go back in time and we try to make some associations with the ancient world. So at this point in history, in the ancient times, the association with ideas, with what we now regard as philosophy, would have been much broader. Philosophy, dealt with issues that most people probably would associate with science in the modern era. Um, the nature of the world, right? What it's made of, where the world came from, things along those lines. But it didn't just do that. So maybe that, in that respect, it was often, even up through the Renaissance and the Reformation era, it was often vocalized or articulated through the sense of natural philosophy. But it deals with a lot of other issues as well, what we might consider religious issues. So the existence of God, the nature of God, the nature of the soul, life after death, human suffering, concepts of salvation, right? All of these were wrapped up into what these ancient Greek philosophers were wrestling with. So in other words, I think the term philosophy had the sense that we might still use today when we talk about someone's worldview. So for me, whenever I think of philosophy, this is why when we created the class, the Worldview Seminar, for instance, we had a lot of different choices. It has a philosophy prefix, right? PHL now, I guess. And that's for good reason. But we didn't name the class the Philosophy Seminar. We named it the Worldview Seminar, and it is thoroughly philosophically based. But I think when we begin to dig into philosophy as members of the 21st century, as academics, we really do, I think, rightly associate it with the term worldview. It was not, as the Greeks were dealing with it, and we see what they're wrestling with, it was not just some sort of an intellectual exercise. It was an integral way of looking at the world and evaluating where we come from, right? Why we're here on earth, where we're going when we die. These are the essential things that the ancient Greeks and subsequently the Romans were trying to address in their philosophies. So, in fact, the life of philosophy was thought, at least was thought by philosophers at any rate, to be the most worthy, the most worthy life that one could possibly lead. It was a life of enlightenment, a life of contemplation, of virtue, of striving after the divine, much like the life of a monk perhaps would be in later ages. So it's little wonder, I think, if we just kind of paint the picture that way, it's little wonder that Christians came to regard their faith as sort of a rival philosophical school. And they ultimately, as we will see when we get to the first and second and third centuries, they took on the Greek philosophers, in a sense, sort of trying to beat them at their own game. So that's kind of a foundation for us as we think about philosophy. And we'll be coming back to, different components of philosophy a little bit later. I am probably going to, sorry, my notes. I am probably going to try to come back and talk about Epicureanism and Stoicism, cynicism, some of the other philosophies in the Roman era because of the applications that we'll be able to make. So let's talk about Socrates, right? So everybody knows the name Socrates. You see the timeline here, 470 to 399. So Socrates is right in this golden age that we're talking about. And he had a significant impact. One of his greatest students, as you probably are aware, was Plato. We're going to talk about another of his students when we get into the Peloponnesian Wars, and we'll talk a little bit about Alcibiades, really phenomenally important as well. But Socrates certainly has some importance for us, and yet really all that we know of Socrates is relayed to us through Plato. Socrates did not write his ideas down. He was very much an orator and believed in this oral tradition and in this dialoguing interaction. So, which is why, of course, when we reference things like the Socratic method, it is this trying to dialogue and force one another to rationally explain our beliefs and to make cases for them, right? To build a case through logic and all the rest. So that's Socrates. Well, what do we know? We know that Socrates, primarily because he believed in the value of questions and questioning one's foundational beliefs, and in the process, perhaps making those beliefs stronger, more verifiable, right? Put to the test. If you put something to the test and it survives, Socrates obviously believed that that is actually going to strengthen your whole association. And I don't think that there's anyone who would argue with that. But we also know this, that in the questioning process, there were those who became increasingly nervous about the ways in which Socrates conducted himself. None more so than the ancient Greeks, especially the ancient Athenians, who became increasingly concerned that Socrates, in the questioning process, was confusing a lot of people, particularly the youth, and perhaps asking them to question their very culture, their very systems that Athenians subscribed to and that helped to keep society in order. And so those who valued tradition and believed in Athenian virtues and believed very deeply that their way of life was sound and good and right and all the rest, what they saw in Socrates was this rebel who was perhaps unintentionally, but nonetheless still undermining components of Greek society, particularly in Athens. And it finally caught up with him, right, famously in 399 BC, when for corrupting the youth, he was sentenced to death and forced to eat hemlock, and he, of course, died. This is what we know of Socrates, at least through this generic historical lens. What we also know about Socrates comes to us through Plato. Again, Plato is, and by the way, guys, you need to make sure that you do your due diligence here and come up with proper spellings, right? So I don't want to read any essays on Play-Doh, Plado or DOH or anything stupid, because that, of course, is the Play-Doh of our youth that we used to mess with and squish together and make things out of. That has nothing to do with the ancient Greek philosopher. So Plato 427 to 347. Plato he's instrumental for us. And what he does is he kind of distills some things that he clearly learned from Socrates. I like that there's in Plato's work, so whether we're talking about Republic, which is probably his most famous work, regardless, Plato works through, he builds cases very well. He thinks logically, and it's always kind of defensively in a sense. And obviously what this means is that he learned well from Socrates, that you must be able to logically construct arguments that reflect, wide systems of thought and consideration. And that if you do this wrong, if you're weak in your associations, then they will be easy to undermine. So the questioning of Socrates actually is instrumental in who Plato is and how he constructs his philosophy. And as critical a character as Socrates is, it is Platonic thought, Platonism and Aristotelianism, right? When we get to Aristotle, so Plato looks to the divine, right? And we will see this, the forms. Aristotle looks to measure the world as it is, looks to the physical structural realities of the world and believes that understanding those things is the key. And so in the famous painting by Raphael, you have Plato pointing up to the sky, and conversely, you have Aristotle, pointing down toward the ground. Just a symbolic gesture that Raphael puts into the painting. So perhaps the most significant of the ancient Greek thinkers regarding the connection to Christianity even is, in fact, Plato. Platonism, right? Which was the development of this great thinker who lived in the 4th century BC, 5th and 4th centuries BC. Plato believed that the physical world, which is always changing and perishable, cannot be the true, perfect reality. He believed instead that the physical world was merely a reflection of something higher and more important and more perfect, a non-physical world, an ideal world. So physical objects, as we see them and interact with them, Plato believed that these physical objects were merely, these pale, fleeting shadows of their eternal, unchanging counterparts in this higher realm. And the higher realm, Plato defined as the realm of the forms, the higher world, the forms. I have this on your outline. You should be using that as you're taking notes here. So matter versus form dualism is something that is essential to understanding Platonic thought, Platonism. The purpose of philosophy then for Plato was to learn to look away or to de-emphasize, maybe a better way to put this, to de-emphasize the material world and instead consider and reconsider and focus on contemplating the eternal, contemplating the spiritual beauty of this ideal realm in the forms. Now, that is all exceedingly abstract, and I realize this. Students are, sometimes, they're itching like Tracy Flick in the film Election. They're like, the hands are shooting up like every 4 seconds. Wait, I don't understand. What do you mean by this? I'm getting confused. So if you're sitting in your apartment or your dorm room or wherever you are and you're wondering, what in the world are you talking about? Fear not, we're going to dig into this a little bit more. So the dualism is just essential to Platonism. The dualistic framework here, matter, form, dualism. Matter being the lower level and the forms being the upper level. So matter and form, raw material in Plato's line of thinking, raw material ordered by the ideal, the rational, the perfect ideas. How do we begin to make sense of this whole orientation? I think it helps, and one of my favorite examples comes to me from a former Wheaton College professor who is a professor of art. And I loved how he put this when he was dealing with Platonism in sculpture, right? So something very interesting. So think of a statue, right? Think of a statue. It consists of marble oftentimes, right? Not always marble, but it's one of the more common elements. It consists of marble crafted into a beautiful shape according to a design or blueprint. Where does that design or blueprint come from? Well, it comes from the sculptor's mind. Okay, so it's similar to Plato's concept of matter-form dualism. Matter, physical matter, as we engage with it, as we see it, as we ourselves are part of that, our physical structure. Matter on its own, Plato regarded as kind of disordered, as chaotic. It required the ideal, the imprint, the blueprint, maybe is the better way to put it, right? The design or the blueprint that was in this ideal realm in the forms. So the forms were rational and good, bringing about order and harmony, making the physical, identifying, imprinting the physical world with this ideal. So the realm of the forms was the pure ideal. The physical world was merely a flawed, a flawed result, a flawed image, a flawed reflection of that ideal realm. So the form of the realm of the pure forms was considered even more real than the material world. So how do we get at this? There are a lot of different ways to start to deconstruct what's going on here, but I think the most effective way is maybe to dig into Plato's famous, maybe one of the most important and widespread references in philosophy is Plato's allegory of the cave. So for Plato, the material world is the realm of error and illusion. We see that certainly in this allegory. True knowledge comes only by freeing ourselves from the bodily senses so that reason can gain insight into the reality of the forms, the realm and its reality. So in Plato's allegory, right, there's this famous description, and you see this in the PowerPoint slide here, right? So you've got these prisoners, and the prisoners essentially are the elements that Plato is using to describe human beings in our physical world that we live in. So that we are kind of prisoners in this realm that we live in the sense that we only experience what we experience, and we can't see beyond the limits of our minds and our experiences. So how we perceive reality is a critical component of what Plato writes and what he describes. So in this allegory, you've got these prisoners, and how they understand their reality is explained by the fact that you have, these images you see cast on a wall. So there's a fire behind these guys here that you see in the slide, and they're holding up these two-dimensional depictions. So whether it's a chair or a table or a cat or whatever the case might be. So the idea is that what the prisoners see is merely a reflection of the real. So they're not. So when the prisoners see a chair or a table or a cat, they're seeing a reflection. They're not actually seeing what is really the true embodiment of those things. One philosopher, Dr. Holmes, actually used to tell us that it's like they were seeing what we might describe as chairness or tableness or catness. I run the risk of the association being Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, but so catness, right? This isn't actually a cat, it's just a reflection of the ideal. So what happens in the allegory? So these prisoners are there, and they're witnessing the shadows being cast on the wall, and these are the items in their minds that they say, that's a cat, that's a chair, that's a table, but really in reality, these are just pale reflections. So in this allegory, one of the prisoners escapes, and escapes his bondage. He goes outside of the cave into the real world, and so for the first time, he's seeing the sky, and he's seeing trees with leaves on them, and the grass, and he's feeling the sun on his face, and the breeze that's rippling through the trees, and we might say, well, what a lucky guy. He's escaped this horrible situation that he's in, and he's finally free at last. Well, interestingly, what does Plato say? The prisoner doesn't stay outside. In fact, he's so overwhelmed, his senses are so overwhelmed by the real, he can't even really comprehend what he's witnessing. He is only able to understand and compute what he has always known. His reality, the confinement, the confining details of his learned reality are all he knows, all he's able to really process and understand. And as beautiful and overpoweringly real, right, as the real world may be, he chooses to come back into the cave and rejoin his fellow prisoners because of this level of extreme comfort. That's the way that Plato helps readers understand what he means by matter and form and the power of the forms. So for just restating something I said a few minutes ago, so for him it's knowledge. Knowledge for us only comes through this lens of freeing ourselves from our physical limitations. And in order to do that, we have to really pursue insight into the realm of the forms. So why does Plato do this is probably the most obvious question. We're not to Aristotle yet. I want to come back to Plato. Why does Plato approach things this way? By the way, we're not doing Aristotle today. For those of you who are thinking we're gonna do this in 30, 40 minutes. Yeah, because we're not doing Aristotle yet. Aristotle is Alexander the Great's tutor. So we're going to get to Aristotle when we deal with Macedonian Greece. Plato, why did he view the world, the material world, as inferior? Well, he made a couple of assumptions that he struggled to explain. I mean, he's not a perfect individual. He's not a perfect being. Of course, there has only been one perfect human being in all of history. Plato is not the one we're referencing, in case you were wondering. So Plato regarded matter as pre-existent, from all eternity. So even though Plato does write about his belief in the existence of a creator, so he believes that the creator sort of imposed rational form upon matter. What does this mean? It meant that the pre-existence of matter is important for us here, because if that were true, it means that matter had independent properties over which the creator had no control. So for Plato, the suggestion here is that as a result, the creator, the deity, was never fully successful in forcing physical matter into the true, mold of the forms. Hence, in Plato's kind of convoluted logic here, he's saying that all the chaos and the disorder and the irrationality in the world as we know it, that comes from the fact that matter was never, fully in alignment with the forms. So creation, Plato writes, creation was divided into these two parts: the spiritual, which of course we know Plato regards as the ideal, the perfect, inherently superior, and the material world, which Plato is very clear when he writes. Plato believes that the material universe, the material world that we all live in, and we as material physical beings are inferior, that we are inherently bad, or that the physical universe is deeply flawed and inferior. Now, what can you tell me about this allocation of logic? Well, for starters, I hope you realize that there is a major flaw just from a biblical perspective as we approach this view, because Plato has misidentified some things. So from a biblical perspective, the problem with Platonic dualism in particular was that Plato has identified the source of chaos, the source of evil more specifically, with some part of God's creation. And yet we know that originally God's creation was declared to be perfect and good. There was no part of it that was at first, initially when it was all done, there was no part of the physical universe that God said this is inherently flawed from the beginning. We are the problem. Human beings were the ones with our free will choice that brought sin into the world and corrupted what was originally created to be perfect and good. So just from a basic starting point here, I want you to make that important notation, that Plato's notion of matter being inherently inferior is a problem from a biblical perspective. Now, I don't want to beat up on Plato and Socrates, or for that matter, ultimately Aristotle later on. I don't want to just suggest that these guys shouldn't be read. Of course they should, and there's much that they argued for that is essential. So they emphasized things like the rational order of the universe, which was enormously important for the development of modern science. These guys stood against the hedonists and many materialists, right, of their day, and they would consistently assert the eternal truths of goodness, truth, beauty. These are essential things. The Apostle Paul references some of this stuff in the New Testament. They argued vehemently, in fact, for objective knowledge and veered away as much as possible from the subjective. Objective knowledge not only is some sort of a social convention, but even further. Plato, by the way, even authored an argument for design based upon his observation of, a goal-directed order in nature. So for all of these reasons, and for many, many more, Christian thinkers in later centuries, on up through the Middle Ages and beyond, Christian thinkers found Socrates, Plato, and ultimately Aristotle too. They found them to be quite congenial. I think that's important to know. But I think it's important for us to offer some critiques as well. These thinkers were pagans. Many of their doctrines are in fact incompatible with biblical truth. So let's come back to this two-story view of reality, of dualism. Classical Greek thought drew a stark division, a dichotomy, right, is the term we use in philosophy. They drew a stark dichotomy between matter and spirit, matter and the ideal. So Plato in particular, as we've noted here, treated the material realm as though it was less valuable than the spiritual realm, sometimes inherently evil, in fact. So salvation for Plato, in a sense, maybe a better word to use here is redemption, right? For the human being, redemption was defined as some sort of abstinence aimed at liberating the human spirit from this mess of a material world, and in doing so, kind of ascend back to this association, this connection to God. That's still pretty abstract. So I want to kind of close this out with a couple of basic components here. What is the big problem? Where does this logic of Plato's kind of take us? Well, first and foremost, the idea that there are inherently inferior or even perhaps evil aspects of the material universe, that these were, even originally as they came into being, they were inherently flawed and horrible. There's a problem regarding this, and it delves into it really connects to how we view God and his omniscience and his omnipotence. So Scripture teaches us, of course, that nothing exists from eternity over and against God. So what that means is matter is not what Plato understands it to be. Matter is not some pre-existing stuff that exists on its own with its independent properties. It is not something that can somehow resist God. God created matter. God then has absolute control over matter. This is, of course, the operative meaning of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, which is, of course, the notion of creation from nothing, because nothing is independent of God's authority and is independent of God's power. So everything comes from him. Everything that exists is subject to him, including all matter in the universe, because he, of course, is the sole authority over it. So this is a critical element. So in contrast to the Greeks then, the Bible presents the material world as, just as I mentioned a second ago, as originally good. Since it was created by God, It reflects his good character. It reflects his good intentions. The Bible does not identify evil with matter or with any other part of God's created order. Where does it identify this evil? It's with sin, human sin. Human beings with free will choice brought sin into the world, and human sin has distorted God's originally good creation. We see this in Galatians chapter 5, right? Paul urges us to avoid the lusts of the flesh. He is not referring in that passage to the body, but is using flesh as a technical term here for the sinful nature. So indeed, there's another theological component here, a very important one actually. If you think about Plato's argument and you think about the implications of it, it would mean that there's a real problem for the Christian in a number of crucial ways. So if we were to say that Plato is correct and that the material universe is inherently evil, there's no way to avoid that evil, we have to be reminded of something very critical, and that is the incarnation, right? When Christ comes to earth, he does not exist as a non-human. He becomes, right? He embraces duality. He is fully God and fully man. He is fully human. So if the human body were inherently sinful, this means that Christ's, not only the incarnation would have been impossible, it also means that there are some other implications with sin and salvation. So Jesus took on a human body, but we know that even in doing so, he remained sinless. The fact that God took on human form speaks decisively about the dignity of the human body, quite separate, quite opposite to what Plato framed. And I think it's really interesting when we get to some of the later Greek thinkers. I don't know if we'll delve back into this part of it or not, but I do think it's surprisingly, or it's interesting that, not surprisingly, the Greek thinkers, one of the biggest hangups they had when it came to Christianity, the most shocking claim that Christians made, involved the idea that God became this historical, physical person who could be seen and heard and could be touched, right? So rational inquiry then could no longer reject the world of the senses, but had to account for historical events like Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection. This is just an impossible task for Platonists who think, as Plato himself did, that the material, the physical, that these are deeply flawed entities and not meant to be where we spend our time in reflection. So this is, for us anyway, for the moment, this is where I want to leave us. I think it's a good introduction to the giants of Greek philosophy. So on Wednesday, as I said, we're going to start digging into the Peloponnesian War. Make sure that you stay up to speed with your reading. For those of you who are in Greek Set 1, remember that you should be working pretty hard this week on getting your individual video bio done and uploaded to YouTube, and then you have to provide me with the link, and then you'll be set to go. So just make sure you're doing that, and make sure your guys are safe and staying out of this god-awful smoke stuff that can really get down into the lungs and wreak all sorts of havoc. So pray for the Willamette Valley to be released from this horrible smoke. Certainly pray for the firefighters and those who've been displaced by the fires themselves, and that we'll all make it through this really strange year that we've all been living through to this point. All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. So we will reconnect on Wednesday in one form or another. It may still be, through a lecture recording, but if we're all really lucky, we'll be together, on campus again and in the OWL Zoom rooms. So take care of yourselves. We'll connect soon. Have a good rest of your day.